All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, Climate Change in Agriculture, the Climate System, and Temperature Dynamics. It is 1 o'clock now, so we're going to get started. I'm Sara, Associate Director for Research at PASA Sustainable Agriculture. This is a meeting has a chat space, and so please feel free to tell us where you're joining from, your farm name, organization, who you are in the chat. We are going to be using the chat for you to ask questions, and that's at the bottom of your screen, that icon. Speakers are going to answer as many as they can, and there will be opportunity at the end to address some questions as well that weren't answered during the presentation time. And finally, at the end, please let us know what you think of this presentation. There's going to be an evaluation link for you to fill out. PASA Sustainable Agriculture is a nonprofit organization that administers farmer training, research, policy, peer education, and local food programs. We're also a network of tens of thousands of farmers, food system professionals, and change makers working together to advance regenerative and equitable agriculture at home in our own communities. So you can learn more about our work at pasafarming.org. The presenters today, I'm very happy to have them with us. They're great partners and collaborators. We have Rachel Schattman, Associate Professor of Agriculture at the University of Maine, Sara Kelemen, New England Soil Health Specialist from American Farmland Trust, and Sean Birkel, Research Assistant Professor from the University of Maine Extension. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean to take it away.
Great. Thank you, Sara, and good afternoon, everyone. So for the next few minutes, I would like to cover the climate system. It's just an overall introduction to help set the stage for understanding climate change and how different components in the climate system work together to produce extreme weather events, for example, and how that, what's the underlying climate connection. But then Sara Kelemen from there will focus on the Northeast region and look at implications for agriculture, as well as discussing some tools that are available. The overall outline of this presentation is first answering the question, what is climate? Just an overall description of that. And then what is the climate system? What are the major components? And then getting into climate change in terms of there's internal variability within the system, as well as external forcings that need to be considered. And of course, for external forcing, that includes greenhouse gas emissions that are driving the warming, especially over recent decades. And then we'll discuss feedbacks within the system and then link that to our observations of more heavy precipitation events and other extremes that are impactful in our everyday lives. What is climate? Well, we can have a complex definition or an easy one. The easiest definition, the simplest, is climate is average weather. A little more expansion on that. Climate is the statistical representation of prevailing meteorological conditions or prevailing weather, and typically over a period of 30 years. And that's often referred to as a climate normal. And that's a definition by the World Meteorological Organization, also used by NOAA. But climate can also be considered on different timescales. NOAA, for example, has short-term and medium-term climate outlook products, 2 weeks, a month, a season. But in general, when we discuss climate, we are usually considering 30 years or longer. It can be a 30-year climatology or 30-year mean or 100-year mean as a basis for comparison to something recent. And the figures at the bottom on the left shows the evolution of weather in a forecast, with each frame being 3 hours from the next. So it's just a 3-hourly weather forecast for 10 days. And this is for December 2023 across North America for temperature. And on the right is the average December temperature from 1991 to 2020. Just to give you this comparison of, on the weather time scale, here's what December temperature looks like at the high frequency changes on the 3-hourly time scale versus a 30-year average for the entire month of December. Now, what is the climate system? Well, the climate system is a number of different systems all interacting, and systems that can influence one another. But the fundamental components are, of course, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the cryosphere. That's the part of the climate system of snow and ice cover, the biosphere, and also the lithosphere. The lithosphere referring to the upper portion of Earth's crust. So that includes mountains in the overall terrestrial landscape. And this is important because mountains, for example, interact with the atmosphere. And as we all have a general sense of, mountains can, in a sense, create weather, create microclimates from how clouds tend to be produced as winds push up against mountain ranges and so on. But overall, as we look through this figure, we can see the different components and how they relate. So there's in the atmosphere, there's the atmospheric chemistry, atmospheric circulation. There's, in terms of the hydrosphere, there's the hydrologic cycle, which in a moment we'll see another slide about that. That includes the overall cycle of water from the oceans through evaporation into the atmosphere, where it's eventually precipitated out, and then back into the terrestrial landscape, lakes, rainfall into lakes, into rivers and streams, and back to the ocean. But all these different systems are constantly interacting and form the climate system. And so over time, as humans modify the surface and modify the atmospheric chemistry, then these different systems will change a little bit in how they interact. And in some ways that can produce big changes for us. It's also important to recognize the vertical part in the atmosphere, that we're most often considering the troposphere, in the lower part of Earth's atmosphere. This is where weather occurs. It's also where about 80% of the atmospheric mass is contained. But there's also, of course, the stratosphere, in which that's where we find the ozone layer, and that has important implications in terms of shielding for UV radiation. And of course, there are other components, the mesosphere, thermosphere. But for our purposes, we're primarily talking about the troposphere, where weather occurs and where there's the majority of atmospheric mass, and also CO2 accumulation, methane accumulation, that has impact on the temperature of the troposphere. And now, but fundamentally, the climate system is driven by where the energy comes from the sun. And the solar radiation emanating from the sun passes through the atmosphere initially as high energy or higher energy shortwave radiation, but then interacts with the surface, where some of the shortwave radiation is absorbed at the surface, and then but some is reflected back up into the atmosphere. But the radiation that's reflected also will be a little bit a longer wavelength, where it can be absorbed by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that includes water vapor, CO2, methane. And the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will then re-emit long wavelengths that can go heat the surface more. So it'll heat the ocean surface and land surface. So originates with the sun, the short waves pass through the atmosphere, and then as they interact with the surface, some of it is absorbed, some goes back up through the atmosphere, where it can then be absorbed by greenhouse gases, and then there's additional heating associated with that. And so you can think of it as it's like putting on a jacket. Adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere reduces the system's ability to cool off. And now, when we talk about climate change, we're really talking about the imbalance between incoming solar radiation and energy lost to space. And as noted here, these changes can occur to internal variability within the climate system and both natural and human source external forcings. And we'll get to that last part on the next slide, but this diagram here it's an expansion upon what I had indicated about shortwave radiation passing through the atmosphere, interacting with the surface in sometimes complex ways, and then also interacting with clouds as the radiation both passes through, some gets absorbed. Very complex, but the long story short is the sun drives the climate system, provides the energy, but then as it passes through the atmosphere and interacts with the parts of the climate system, that is being impacted as there's then human modification of the atmosphere. Atmospheric circulation. And in here, we can think of atmospheric winds and how that relates to the jet stream and how the jet stream can interact with and steer storm systems that can then have very real impacts on our everyday lives. And now to simplify this diagram, it's I show this just so you can get a sense of from the equator to the polar regions, the solar heating drives atmospheric circulation, which includes along the thermal equator, air rising and then moving poleward, where then cools and descends, forming a circulation cell. And along this boundary is where we find the middle latitude westerly winds and the jet stream. And but there are different cell features that can form different circulation features that ultimately link back to solar heating, but also the Earth's rotation, which is why we start to see high pressure systems and low pressure systems developing. And we don't have time to go too far down that track, but to now discuss the internal variability parts that can cause changes in climate on the shorter time scale, and as well as greenhouse gas warming. The panels on the left illustrate the important natural sources. Volcanic aerosols, a large volcanic eruption such as Mount Pinatubo that erupted in 1991, that is known to have cooled climate temporarily for anywhere from about 3 to 5 years, depending on the measure. Volcanic aerosols will reflect sunlight back into space, especially if they can get into the stratosphere, and which after Pinatubo, there was a significant impact on the stratosphere, and it did cause a cooling. There's also the 11 to 14 year solar cycle, in which we're now around the solar maximum, and we've been seeing aurora. The sun releases a little bit more energy during solar maxima as opposed to minima. It's relatively small. It does have a measurable impact on climate, but it is small. And then for internal variability, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So that's El Nino, which is a relative warming of the equatorial Pacific, which is also associated with a change in winds, where there's a weakening of easterly winds across that area, which ties into the larger circulation as well. Strong El Nino and La Nina events, La Nina being the cool mode events. So those events can have a big impact on worldwide weather. And El Nino and La Nina tend to oscillate approximately 3 to 5 years. It's not a perfect oscillation, but it does vary typically between 3 and 5 years, sometimes 3 and 6 years. And right now the system is trending towards La Nina, moving away from a recent El Nino, which was very strong in 2023 and into the first part of 2024. Now, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, especially in the second half of the 20th century, that's when greenhouse gas emissions really started to have a measurable impact on climate. And this figure here shows the measured rise of CO2 at Mauna Loa in Hawaii and from about 1960 onward, and then from a proxy record from Antarctica, where um, uh, air trapped in bubbles in ice. Ice has been cored into the Antarctic ice sheet. This has also been done in the Greenland ice sheet. And scientists can measure the concentration of the trace gases within those air bubbles. And when we look at CO2, we see that going back for 500,000 years, um, there's been this natural cycle associated with what we call ice ages. But since the Industrial Revolution, there's now this imbalance where the natural background signal of CO2 has increased substantially, and that is the primary cause of changes that we're seeing today. And just to note, these cycles over 10,000 and 100,000 year timescales associated with the Ice Age. And at the height of the last Ice Age, roughly 20,000 years ago, there was a large ice sheet that covered North America down to Long Island, New York, and covered the Northeast region. But that's a story for another day. And now moving on to future climate projections. And we'll focus more on what we've been observing recently. But climate models can be used to project into future decades and this next century based on inputs, known variability from the sun, also input from volcanic eruptions, and most importantly, from changing greenhouse gas concentrations. And we can run simulations to see what future climate might be. But this slide is meant to show that the models are actually calculating weather. They're models that generate weather using physics, and then they can run projecting out 100, 200 years, and we can try to understand how these changes will manifest. Now, the models are driven by, I mentioned these energy imbalances, and so there's a radiative forcing associated with greenhouse gas emissions, with aerosol or dust emissions from human activity, changes in land use, and changes in solar irradiance, which, as I mentioned, were relatively small, volcanic aerosols. And then we can also sum all of these different forcings and find the overall impact. That's what's shown here in the upper left, where the greenhouse gas radiative forcing that's been estimated over the past century and a half is shown in the green bars. And so we have the positive radiative forcings versus the negative radiative forcings. And when we sum those, this dashed line here shows that between about 1930 and 1960, that's when the human-caused warming signal began to emerge from the noise of natural variability. Now, using climate models, we can test this and see how in these physically based models with inputs of known solar variability, volcanic aerosol emissions, and land use changes, what do the models show? How does the climate evolve if there are increases in greenhouse gases or if those are kept at natural levels? And that's what's shown in this panel on the right. And so the simulations with only natural forcings is shown in blue, including greenhouse gases is the increases are shown in red. And then this black line here is the global mean observed temperature. And you can see again, the signals begin to depart between about 1930, 1960, and then onward from 1960, the warming that's taken place is unexplainable in the absence of greenhouse gas warming. And the climate today would likely be like it was 100 years ago in the absence of that. Now, I realize, just trying to keep track of time here, all this produces in the climate system, where systems can feed back on one another, that produces changes in atmospheric circulation and subtle changes in weather that can have very big impacts to us. And as the climate warms, that also includes the warming of the upper levels of the world ocean, which enhances evaporation. and which is associated with an intensified hydrologic cycle, which I mentioned before. And so this is the part that is associated strongly with seeing more heavy precipitation events, for example, and an overall tendency for more extreme weather patterns to form. In terms of heavy precipitation events, with a warming atmosphere, the water holding capacity of air increases by about 7% for every 1.8 degree Fahrenheit warming. That's an important part of why we're seeing more heavy rainfall events. There's also amplification that occurs in the Arctic as sea ice and snow cover declines. That facilitates more warming, which then facilitates more ice and snow decline. And that also links up into changes occurring in the atmospheric circulation. So all this works together to produce these changes in weather patterns over time that we're seeing that produce extremes. And getting back to precipitation, the Northeast region has seen the largest increase in heavy precipitation events that are the 99th percentile or greater. And I think we've all seen examples in the past 20 years of increasing damage and impacts from heavy rainfall. Now, connecting extremes through the jet stream. I've mentioned circulation a number of times and linking that back to the jet stream. Well, there's been a tendency for more extreme patterns to develop, what we call blocking patterns, under which extreme temperature extremes can develop, where a pattern sets in place for several days or even 2 weeks, development of a heat wave or a cool wave, and then that produces a horizontal or a horizontal gradient. When that pattern breaks down, it also tends to fuel a strong storm. In this example from fall of 2019, in the Northeast region, there was a strong heat wave that developed in association with a strong cold wave that plunged down into the center part of the continent. And on the East Coast, and especially here in New England and into Maine, there was a major windstorm that developed. There are actually two, one in the middle of October and the one 2 weeks later, very first part of November. On the other side of the continent, there were record forest fires that were facilitated by strong Santa Ana winds associated with this extreme jet stream setup. And the fires themselves were likely caused by electrical equipment, but the strong winds that persisted facilitated the spread of what became one of the very large wildfires in California. Just a couple of examples of other extremes we've seen in recent years. March 2012, a record high pressure blocking set up over the interior of North America, eventually moved its way east. And in Maine, we saw 80-degree temperatures third week in March. And it was a record-setting event in New England, especially an event without historical analog. And more recently, in 2023, a lot of extremes developed that year. And to just highlight the month of May, there was a ridge that developed in the jet stream that, for climatology going back to 1940, it was a record event. And the impact on the weather associated with that, for two examples, one was the May 18 late season frost or freeze event, depending on where in the Northeast that occurred. And in the northern part of the Northeast, that you'd have to go back to the 1950s to find a comparable event. And then, I thought I had another example, but you may recall in very first part of June of 2023, there was a severe reduction in air quality from a weather pattern that was transporting wildfire smoke from Quebec into across parts of New York and Pennsylvania. And that was associated with stalled low pressure. And that was also linked to this large scale pattern over North America. And so now I'd like to close out with, here's a record of estimated global mean temperature since 1940, daily time scale. And orange shows the line for 2023, red is 2024. And so the last couple of years have been, we've seen record warmth across North Atlantic, and we've been managing some extremes that are associated with that. And so now I'd like to take any questions you might have, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean. If folks would like to take, Sarah, can we like switch the schedule a little bit and do like 5 minutes for questions and then we'll start our presentation? Okay, great. If people have any questions for Sean live, you can feel free to either put them in the chat or talk to folks. Can people unmute if they do have a question? Is that possible? Yes. Okay. We'll set it so that you can unmute if you so wish. But thank you so much, Sean. That was a really interesting talk. I feel very lucky that I've had the pleasure of seeing Sean talk on a regular basis, and I always learn something new about what's going on in our atmospheric system whenever I get the chance to. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, if there are no questions, no worries. And we can always, were we supposed to answer questions later on?
Yeah, we're gonna be able to do both, but that's
Okay.
okay. But sometimes it's nice to give people a chance to say something when it's at the top of their mind. So folks, you should have the ability to unmute now if you want. I'm gonna take like 2 seconds to set up our screen share for the next part of the talk. So you have a few seconds.
Oh, and I also meant to say that now Sara Kelemen will focus on the Northeast region and agriculture, and build from this information and see how agriculture is being impacted. So thank you, everyone.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sean. All right, shall we kick it off?
Yeah, let's kick it off. And I'm gonna kind of throw Sean under the bus here a little bit and say that Sean is really good at answering questions in the chat. I've seen it happen before. So if you have questions about the climate system while Rachel and I are talking, I encourage you to put them in the chat, and I bet Sean will get back to you. Okay, go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah. All right, that's brilliant and so wise. Yeah. Okay, so I'm Rachel Schattman at Sara Bay, so graciously introduced me at the top of the hour. I'm really lucky to be here with Sara Kelemen, my colleague at American Farmland Trust. And what we're going to do is take some of that big picture climate system information that Sean just shared with you and translate it into some things that are near and dear to all of our hearts, including impacts on agriculture and tools that are related to temperature that you can use and access to mitigate the effects of these changes on your farm, both your crops, your livestock, and also the people that are part of your business or your homestead. So we're going to start off going briefly over these 4 sections. We're not going to spend too much time in the climate system since Sean covered that so well, but we are going to focus on the Northeast to make it just a little bit more useful for folks in this room. So let's get started with temperature data trends. Sara, take it away.
Thank you. Okay, so this is basically just a recap of what you heard from Sean. And I took Sean's whole really nice long talk and tried to put it on one slide and connect it to agriculture. So basically, fundamentally, what we're seeing is increasing temperatures across all seasons. They're not increasing evenly everywhere in the region, but increasing temperatures across all seasons. This is causing a shift in precipitation patterns. You heard Sean say for every 1.8 degree increase in temperature, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water. What does this mean for our intensifying water system and the shifts in precipitation? And then how do those temperature and precipitation impacts change the way that our agricultural systems function? Some examples are more extreme weather events, water availability, farm worker health and safety, and kind of the list goes on and on. So we're going to kind of narrow down and talk about these impacts. Okay, so what you're seeing here is that the average regional temperature in our Northeast region has increased by about 3 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1970s. But you can see that warming isn't consistent across the region. So the darker red color is about 2.5 degrees Celsius per decade. where the lighter colors is less change. So you can see that there's some more there's regions where there's been more temperature change and less temperature change. And then if you look at the figure on the right, you can see what I'm saying. So the rate of increase in temperature has gone up sharply since the 1960s, 1970s. It has doubled and in some case even tripled this rate of increase. If you look at the difference between the 1901 to 2022 average versus the 1960, 1970 to 2022 average. So we're seeing more warming faster. Another thing that I think is really interesting to think about, usually I think when we talk about climate change, people's instinct is to think like, oh, hot summers, heat waves, which yes, is a part of what we're seeing. But what we're also seeing and what we're really seeing is that winters are warming faster than other seasons, significantly so. And this is especially true in both our region in the Northeast and in kind of the upper Midwest. And what this figure over here on the right shows, which I think is really interesting, is you can really see this over the year. So on the bottom is the months, and on the left is temperature change. And you can see just a dramatic increase in temperature in the winter months, January, February, November, and December, relative to change during the summer months. And when I think about this change, I think about how this is going to impact this region where we're used to seeing some snow on the ground in the winter. We're going to get more of our precipitation as rain, less as snow. And how does that impact the way that we're thinking about managing soil, managing our infrastructure, and keeping our soil covered in the winter? Next slide. Okay, and now I'm going to hand it off to Rachel, who's going to talk about how these changes in temperature affect our agricultural systems.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. So as Sara really pointed out really well just now, one of the things that we have to think about in the Northeast is not just the increasing temperature that we're going to be experiencing in the summers, although that's obviously important, and I am going to talk about that next. But something that's just as important is the fact that our winters are warming and that this has implications for how we are managing the crops that we have in our region. So for those of you who grow tree fruit, for example, you're familiar with the requirements for chill hours in the winter in order for adequate fruit set to take place. So with a reduction in cold weather in the winter, there is also the potential for localized and regionalized decreases in chill hours, leading to implications in tree fruit production. There's also just the injuries that are associated with big swings in temperatures. So we have all experienced in recent years springs that have oscillated between incredibly warm periods. I think we got 80 degrees in March not that long ago. Sean can probably tell me exactly what year that was then followed by a heavy frost and a freeze. So what happens is when, especially tree fruit, but other crops as well, break dormancy during those early warm spells, and then we go back into a freeze, is sometimes the reproductive capacity can be greatly diminished. The apple crop, for example, in Michigan was dramatically reduced for several years over the last 10 years because of these kind of early springs followed by frost. Sometimes these are known as false springs. For those of us who till and who rely on open seed beds to plant annual crops, there's also a concern that longer, wetter springs, as opposed to the snowpack that we're used to having, just creates more opportunity for soil to travel off the field in the form of runoff in the spring before there's a lot of biomass to hold it in place. Additionally, with warming winters, we know that pests and invasive species have different toeholds in our ecosystem, especially for things that overwinter in our region. A less cold winter can mean that a greater proportion of a population from the previous year survives, which means we enter into a production season with just that much more pressure. Obviously, warming temperatures in the summer are also quite significant. Even though our summers are not warming as quickly as our winters, the concerns are very dramatic. We all know what it's like to work out in very, very hot weather. We know what it's like to have our crews out there and to be worried about their health and well-being. It also, of course, changes pest and disease dynamics, and by extension, the dynamics that those organisms have with our crops. There's plenty of research in commodity crops to show that there's yield loss associated with heat stress. Pollen viability goes down, and other kind of crop physiological functions can decrease. Many of you have probably heard that when you get above a certain temperature, the stomata in the leaves of crops kind of shut to preserve water inside the plant leaf, which is a great survival tactic, but also significantly reduces photosynthesis and growth. So we can see crop stunting, even if the crops live through heavy heat periods. A lot of the mitigation tools that we have at our disposal are related to water. So there's an increase in water demand from crops and livestock also in warm temperatures. But overall, plants do not like high heat if they have been well adapted to temperate climates in general. And of course, there's lots of variation. But when we think about livestock and heat's effect on livestock, a lot of this is going to be intuitive to you that manage animals. Obviously, higher body temperatures and increased respiration can change animal behavior. We see a decrease in grazing, which means the animals are not moving around as much. They're pooping all in one place, so you get a manure concentration, and they require more water. So you have to be able to get water to your animals. When we are thinking about milking animals, this often translates into a reduction in the amount of dry matter that they eat, and that, of course, reduces their milk production overall. There's also effects on reproductive processes and growth and weight gain in general. Now, this has all been this is kind of a downer. I'm sorry for this part of the presentation. There are, of course, silver linings to all of this. I think we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, but there's also, I think, some opportunities ahead of us as well, flavored with uncertainty. So yes, we might have longer growing seasons, which might give us more capacity for things like double cropping. We might have more growing degree days. We might be able to grow new crops. It's just an interesting transition period where you have to kind of be on your toes because it's hard to know what to expect in any given year. All right. We are going to transition now away from talking about what the impacts are to talking about the tools that you can use to deal with these challenges. We tried to group these tools into different categories because, as we were talking about in preparation for this talk, tools can mean anything that you use to help you make a decision, implement a new system, evaluate a system. So it's a really big term. Some of the things that I think are most useful are trying to think about what kind of season we have ahead. Now, obviously, weather forecasts are not crystal balls. There's a lot of probability involved in interpreting them. But one of the things that I really like are the NOAA seasonal outlook tools. They create these tools for temperature and for precip. Sean writes a great mini newsletter article for the Maine extension listserv every month or every couple months that includes a summary of what these forecast tools look like that I always find really helpful. And basically what it tells you is what are the chances that the coming months are going to be above or below normal temperatures or rainfall if you're looking at the rainfall tool. What it requires you to know is what normal is. So for that information, I like to go to Sean's climate reanalyzer tool that he has on the Maine Climate Office website. And you saw some version of this chart in Sean's presentation. I made this a little bit more specific to be the Northern Hemisphere. But what it gives you a sense of is for every month, what is actually the average temperature, so that you can then make an estimation of what does above average mean, what does below average mean for any given time period. There's also a lot of production tools that we have available to us. They all depend on your individual farm and your individual system to know where they make practical sense, logical sense, economic sense. and where they're going to be most effective. But some of the ones that we talk about a lot in terms of dealing with heat are things like considering changing your planting period, irrigating where possible. Certainly irrigation has become much more prevalent in the Northeast in recent decades, and people who maybe previously relied on ambient precipitation have found that it's a much safer bet to go with irrigation, even if there is some upfront cost associated with it. Intercropping is a way to keep living roots in the soil for longer. In some cases, there is a competitive water demand with cash crops, so that there might be a requirement that you get more water out there to help those crops deal with heat. But in general, shading the soil is a great way to kind of preserve the health and well-being of your crops. And you can intercrop with either cash crops or cover crops, depending on your system. Using white or reflective mulches instead of black mulches, using shade cloth or ventilation for indoor production. And I've seen large trellis systems for things like berry crops to keep out spotted winged Drosophila. People are putting insect netting out. You could also consider putting out shade netting if need be. And then, of course, selecting heat tolerant varieties or cultivars is an important way to go also. I'm just going to go over a couple more tools before I pass it back to Sara. This is an example of a tool that was developed by some colleagues in Alaska. We don't currently have one of these for the Northeast, although I'd be curious to hear from people on this webinar if you think something like this would be useful. But basically, it's a sliding, actually, I have it right here, so you can kind of see in my camera. It slides back and forth, so you can move the calendar, and it allows you to place the date of the last frost on the date that it actually happened, and then estimate planting and harvest activities based on that. It's kind of like an analog version of using a growing degree day calculator, which is a much more precise and probably sophisticated way to go. This is a tool by the climate smart farming people at Cornell. And what they do is they track growing degree days for you. They allow you to change your base temperature, which many plants have a 50-degree base temperature, but some have a 40-degree or a 30-degree, and change your planting date to make estimations about harvest time and other management activities based on not the calendar, which has proven to be a less reliable way to go in our modern times, but on the conditions in any given year. And if anyone doesn't know what growing degree days are or how to calculate them, I can put something in the chat to point you to how to do that. The last thing I think, or maybe I have a couple more, but one really helpful thing to remember that we're all really familiar with is that in a lot of seed catalogs, there are indications in the variety descriptions that say whether or not a variety of a particular plant is tolerant to heat or tolerant to drought. And so I think as we start to experience more heat in the summer, that really keeping that in mind when you're doing your seed ordering and your crop planning will be an important way to go. All right, this really is my last slide before I hand it off. This session is about temperature. Our session next week is about precipitation and water management. Obviously, the two interact all the time. This is another climate smart farming tool called the water deficit calculator, and it helps to use environmental conditions in your region to estimate how likely it is that you are going to need to get some supplemental water out onto your crops, depending on what you're growing, what your soil is like, when you planted, and the precip. All right, yes, thank you.
Okay, so Rachel just talked about some tools you can use for your cropping systems. I'm going to talk about livestock and then humans. So in your livestock system, some things that you can think about are providing water and shade at all locations. These kind of pop up shade structures that you can move. They have a hitch, so you can attach it to a tractor. You don't even need a tractor to move this one around. You can use like a gator or something with a little bit less power. And so they're movable shade structures, so you can integrate shade into your rotational grazing really easily and quickly. Livestock love shade. They love to be in the shade, and wherever these go, your livestock will follow. So providing adequate shade structures is also really important so that you don't get kind of that clumping and grouping effect that Rachel was talking about earlier. A more long-term, but also appropriate way to implement shade is through silvopasture. And, silvopasture can either be additive, or you can remove, so you can plant trees for a silvopasture, or you can remove trees from kind of a more forested ecosystem in a managed way and integrate livestock. It's more long-term, but there's a lot of really, really cool and interesting research on how silvopastures, even when they're reducing the amount of forage that's available in the silvopasture system, often the animal output is the same as it would be on a non-silvopasture system, plus you get the added economic benefit of whatever that silvopasture crop is. So you're keeping your animal output the same, plus you get the benefit of the shade and the silvopasture product. In this figure on the bottom, you can just see the heat load on the backs, measured on the backs of animals in the summer. The kind of lighter brown color is the morning, the darker brown is the afternoon, and you can see that in open pasture versus a couple of different silvopasture systems, the difference in heat that the animals are experiencing during the day. It's pretty dramatic. This figure shows heat stress days and number of cows across the country. And the reason why I'm showing you this to talk about selecting heat tolerant breeds is so that you can see how many cows we have in hot parts of the country, which means this is something we're already doing. This is something we have experience with, and we need to be thinking about how we can use the strategies that livestock producers, particularly in this case, dairy producers in the southern part of the country, are already using. So cows in the Northeast experience more episodic heat stress, so like really hot days with cool days in between. And because it takes a while for cows to acclimatize to heat, that episodic heat stress is really tough to handle. So there's ongoing research about how to make both dairy and beef cattle more resilient to temperature. There's the slick gene in cattle, which improves the heat tolerance with kind of slick or short hair. Comes from South America and the Caribbean. And people are working on how to breed it into the dairy cattle that we're more familiar with seeing up in the Northeast. In sheep, interestingly, I kind of tend to think of hair sheep as being more resilient to higher temperatures, but actually, interestingly, wool sheep that are adapted to hot environments don't really differ from hair sheep in their temperature resilience. Basically, overall, what I'm trying to say here is that it's more important that animals are adapted to high temperatures than that you search for breeds that are adapted to high temperatures. However, we can move animals that are a little bit more heat resilient and heat adaptive up into our region. Keeping your animals comfortable means providing ventilation fans and misters. In these figures, you can see that this is body heat and time of day. And livestock tend to dump heat overnight. They really need, their body temperature goes up, so they need cooler temperatures overnight so that they don't get overheated. And we are seeing both warmer winters and warmer nights is a big part of what we're seeing shift in our climate system. So keeping livestock cool overnight means running fans, and running fans, especially during the night. You can see in this lower image, the lower figure, how running fans really, really helps to regulate the body temperature of livestock throughout the day and overnight. And a wind speed of about 4 to 6 miles an hour is recommended. So how do you know the temperature of your livestock? There are some pretty expensive ways to monitor this, but if you don't have the means to be spending $200 to $800 per animal to monitor, you can just keep track of water intake, fans, and fan speed, and that will help you to get a sense of the cooling potential that you're giving to your animals. Next slide, please. Okay, lastly, you can integrate warm season grasses and forbs into your pastures, which will help to alleviate the summer slump that we're all pretty familiar with, where the kind of cool season annuals and perennials stop producing as much during late June, July, and August. And if you're planting warm season annuals, including switchgrass, big and little blue stem, Indian grass, eastern gamma grass, trefoils, many others, teff, sorghum, millet, those can help to kind of get you through that summer slump period. Okay, humans, very important. Keeping good care of our humans. So this is an example of a hot workday standard operating procedure, which basically says if it's over 90 degrees, or there are some other conditions, then here's what we do. And we have linked here. We'll share the PDF of these slides. You can. We have a link so you can make your own hot weather standard operating procedure, and a link to some other hot weather resources that you can look at when you're thinking about how you and your workers want to be operating when it's really hot out. Next slide. One thing to think about when you're putting together your hot weather day standard operating procedure is the effect that humidity has on how it feels. So depending on the weather app or the weather system that you use, you'll see there's like the real feel. And this is basically this is showing you how real feel is calculated. Basically, the higher the humidity is, the temperature will feel hotter because there's more of that water vapor in the air. And so this is just a resource that you can reference if you're making that hot weather day standard operating procedure. Next slide, please. This is an alert system that you can use. Again, we're going to share the slides, and it helps you to understand, the risk that you or your crew might be experiencing if you are outside and it's really hot out. And finally, the National Weather Service has this new heat risk tool that combines weather and climate data to identify when you might get potentially dangerous heat. So again, this is just another resource if you want to use it when you're thinking about when it is or isn't safe to be working outside. And I'm going to hand it back to Rachel to close us out.
All right, thank you so much. Well, this is just a summary of what we hope you can take away from the time that we've spent together. First, the heat is going to be something that we are going to be dealing with more in coming decades for sure, and that the changing temperatures that we're expecting are definitely going to affect both crops and livestock systems as well as human health. I was kind of laughing as we were putting together the third and fourth summary points, because my perspective on cropping systems is that adapting to heat involves thinking about timing, shade, water, and variety. And Sara was putting together the summary of livestock systems. And again, it's about timing, shade, water, and breeds. So there are some common themes there. So with that, we will say thank you. And we are happy to use the rest of the time to talk through your questions if you have any. I think there are a couple questions for Sean in the chat. Sean, do you mind if I start us off with one of those?
Sure. And I just submitted a partial answer. It is much easier to describe.
Sure. Why don't we go for that? So why don't you first say what the question is? That'd be helpful.
So the first question is from Matthew, who asks, or who says, are climate models able to predict more regional extreme events? And do these projections seem to be improving with time? So overall, to give you an idea of how the climate model projections are used, and when we say climate model, there's a worldwide consortium called CMIP. It's a coupled model intercomparison project, whereby research groups from around the world, each using one or more climate models. Some of these models are similar to one another, some are different, but they all use physics of the atmosphere and ocean to project climate. And how the typical approach is to work with what are called multi-model ensembles. So simulations from multiple models, and each model can have several different runs. Now, climate is a dynamical system, and it just like in a weather forecast, if you look at different weather forecast models, you'll see that the results will differ, sometimes a little bit, sometimes by a lot. But with climate models, by using, say, 10 or 20 models, and each of those models has, say, 5 or 7 individual runs, you have a spread of results that produces say if there's a 100-year simulation, there's a cloud around the mean. We can use statistics to parse out how many models are predicting this outcome versus another. And so it's possible to then assess what is the likelihood, say if we're interested in heavy rainfall events in the Northeast region, we can see what percentage of models is projecting more or less, and use statistics to try to identify the likelihood of changes in the future based on these model results. And I posted in the chat 2 links, one of which is, they're both from carbonbrief.org, which has a lot of really good information on the site. It has an overview of utilizing climate models to try to better understand future rainfall. And so that's a great resource to check out. And then the other link is a broader overview, how do climate models work? And so that'll give you more information on how they're used in ensemble and how statistics can be calculated from those. I should say it is also very important to analyze historical observations and at the local and regional scale to see what has happened in recent decades. And then when we do scientific studies for a given region, we will compare the climate model projections. We'll compare how those historical trends that are observed to try to evaluate to make sure that the models are indeed capturing what we observe in the recent decades, and then that helps us to assess the projections into the future as well. So there's historical analyses and historical trends, and we pair that with projections based on models that have been that they've been validated against historical observations as part of this international consortium. So it's a lot of information. I hope that I helped to answer the majority of the question, but
I think that's great. Thank you, Sean. I do
Welcome.
see that we are at the top of the hour, so I would just invite people, if you would like to have any other questions answered, you can email us directly. We'll put our emails in the chat, and I will hand it back to Sara Bay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel, Sarah, and Sean. I too also took away some new things from your presentations. Quick reminder that there is an eval link in the chat, as well as emails from our 3 presenters. So please let us know what you thought of this. Please join us next week, same time, same place, to dive into precipitation dynamics and climate change. So thank you everybody again for joining, and thanks so much to our presenters. Have a great day.